Have you ever contemplated your own life? So you'll just be walking along a street or just sitting next to a window, or maybe for whatever reason your phone dies and you're just forced to think for once without the constant chaos of urban life. What do you think in those moments? Do you ever reflect on your own life and for whatever reason you're not happy, you're not content, you're not balanced in your own heart and in your own soul, and you just look into the world and you can't rationally figure out a reason for your own unhappiness and a state of bereft and profound misery. However, for whatever reason, you just feel like your life lacks a meaning and that your life lacks purpose. This, in a nutshell, encapsulates what, if not majority, most or a significant minority of people in the modern world feel today. And I recently read a book called The Eye of Shiva by Amourie de Riencourt, which pretty much opened my eyes to a completely new way of thinking and a new way of being, so to speak. And it instead of pointing me towards the future, it actually answered some profound questions about the past, which I didn't even know I had. So the world that our ancestors lived in, and by ancestors I mean our pre-modern ancestors, before civilization, before even the concept of a wheel or fire or a hut, man just lived in the wild. And in those moments, there was the line that we have today between, say, the material world and the subjective world or the spiritual world did not exist. For hunter gatherers, even today, the world is just the world, and the religion, so to speak, that they practiced would be today considered animism or shamanism. But essentially it is a magical worldview of looking at the world, and especially as an Indian and a Hindu, I'm deeply aware of this, simply because modern Hindu religion has some traces of animism and shamanism still in there. So, what do I mean by a magical worldview of looking at the world? Well, think about the Native Americans, or for that matter, think about Indians today. When they look at the sun, they don't just see a ball of gas, which is a thermonuclear reactor, which is powering the earth. They see a god. When they look at the sky, the ancestors of Indo-Europeans saw Deus Pater, or the Sky Father, and they called him Zeus, they called him Indra, whatever they called him. They saw, like, so for them it was not that, okay, yeah, this is the modern world and then there are my religious beliefs which are there as something separate. For them, the world was a place of magic, the world was a place where gods existed, and they would have all of these hallucinogenic or psychedelic experiences, what we would call psychedelic experiences, where they would take magic journeys, where they would just how we would characterize as go crazy. But basically they lived in complete harmony with nature, not in the sense that, they weren't cruel to each other or there was no war. Of course, that time was also bloody and brutal and violent, but in the sense that for people, that how modern people struggle with a sense of meaning, that just did not happen, because life was hard enough and meaning just seemed to be ever present. And imagine for a second that, leave aside your rational faculties and think about a world where literally you wake up and you look at the sky and it is Deus Pater, or when you look at the sun and it is a literal god, or the way we Hindus have thought always about their own earth, is that the soil itself on which you're standing on is sacred, or your familial relationships are not just people who you were born in the same family with, but rather they are deep religious bonds. Like, marriage used to be a bond where a man would be bound to a woman in religious matrimony. So everything had meaning, and so those people never wondered. However, with the birth of civilization, that worldview slowly began to fade away. Why is that? Because to build a civilization, it is very difficult to have magical thinking, which is why, as societies became more advanced, more technologically advanced, that magical worldview slowly began to fade away. This process of civilization happened in the East and the West. However, it took two different roads and it took two different paths. So, if you look at the world, roughly the world can be divided into the world of perception, right? It can be divided into two: the subject and the object. The subject, or the one who perceives, and the object, the one that gets perceived. Um, the West was ruled by intellectual titans such as, particularly Aristotle, who really gave the Western world its own sort of ideological and philosophical direction. And the way the Western world went, it went the way of Aristotelian logic, which was I am the subject, I am the perceiver, I perceive the object, and it sort of removed the subject, or it took all of those subjective phenomena and it just stopped talking about them. So the way modern science works is that we dismiss everything that cannot be measured, that cannot be quantified. We say, okay, that's your subjective experience, but let's focus on what is measurable, what is reproducible, and all of what meets those scientific criteria. And this was a powerful mechanism for the development of technology, right? So Western science just progressed by leaps and bounds simply because they developed the scientific method, which allowed a lot of inaccuracies and you could call superstitious ways of thinking to be eliminated, and it allowed for newfound practicality. The West went from height to height. They achieved a level of technological sophistication which is not seen, which in recorded history, or the history that most people are aware of, has not been seen before. And they were able to conquer the entire world, right? So it was that the Europe, a tiny little Europe with a fraction of the population, was just able to take over Africa because they had guns and planes and the Africans had spears. And this sort of rational thinking truly allowed Europe to become a great civilization. But that way of thinking had its own flaws. What was the key flaw? When you try to reduce everything to in terms of rational and measurable terms, you hit the brick wall of that which is impossible, of that which defies measurement, that which defies quantification. And maybe this particularly applies to social world. Like, I cannot calculate who I should be friends with, I cannot calculate who I should marry. So many of our deepest decisions, the decisions that truly affect the rest of our life, have to be taken with your gut feeling or intuition, or as you say, just blindly hope and pray for the best. This was the Western way of thinking, and that way of thinking would get challenged later on by quantum mechanics, which I'll talk about later. But until the 1950s, this was the thought process that the Western world took. On the other hand, the Eastern world took the exact opposite way. So I talked about how we perceive the world as the subject and the object. The Eastern world went the exact opposite way, where the West would dismiss anything that is subjective or that is regarding the perceptual. The East went to say that the object itself is not real in that sense. So Hindus and Buddhists and all the people who have Confucian and Shinto beliefs, they believe that the whole world is what is known as Maya, or Maya is like an illusion spun by the gods, and it's not real in that sense. So Hindus believe that there is something known as a Brahman, which is the repository of supreme and cosmic knowledge, and I have something known as the Atma, which is my soul, and then there's the Param Atma, or the supreme soul. And the whole point of life, or the point of an enlightened soul, is to do your duties upon this earth, but to do them in a sort of detached way, because the ultimate goal is to find liberation from this mortal coil, and then fuse or find union with the Param Atma and achieve a state of moksha or nirvana, which is the ultimate bliss that you feel when your soul is united with the cosmic soul. So rather than focusing on the subjectivity of it, the East went and embraced that subjectivity, and it developed some of the most profound philosophies in the world, which definitely harmonized, placed emphasis on harmony and coexistence. And this allowed civilizations and societies which were remarkably stable in a way that Western societies just were not. And I'll give you a classic example. That is, you often see that Hindu dynasties are, especially such as the one of I'm blanking on the name. Ponniyin Selvan. So this is from the southern kingdom of Cholas, and their dynasties went on much longer than the Muslim or the Christian or the Western dynasties. And the simple reason for this is the Hindu concept of sannyas and vanvas. Which is that when you have lived your life to a certain way, you realize that all your duties are done, and then you embark on a higher purpose of life, which is to renounce the material world and to go into a forest and meditate and think about your relationship to the divine. So what would happen is that kings, right? Kings, absolute monarchs, they, when their age came, they would usually have one wife or maybe two wives, but they would have some sons, and then the best son, so to speak, would be chosen by the council of elders. And once that son was chosen, the king would not stick around until he died. In fact, he would get to whatever old age, pretty much 40, 50, and then he would go into sannyas, and the young son would then get to rule. Which would reduce and take away the causes of a lot of jealousy. And I'm not saying that these things did not happen, because power corrupts everyone. So of course these wars happened for succession. But the thing about East, it can be marked by profound philosophical depth, profound spiritual wisdom, and societies which are remarkably stable. Along with it, one more thing to be seen was that there was this concept of grassroots level democracy. So in India, of course, there's top-down democracy, but there's also there's something known as a gram panchayat, which is a whole village just comes together, votes, and takes decision for itself. So if you look at India historically, we have, of course, we've never had top-down democracy, because at the top there would always be a king. But oftentimes the decisions at the lower levels would be taken by group consensus. So however, the flaw of Eastern thinking was that it was really impractical. Because if you see the whole world as illusion, if your topmost and most brilliant minds are just sitting in meditation all day and contemplating the absolute, how will they develop new and new technologies? If you see the world as an illusion, what motivation do you have for building a strong state, developing new weapons of fighting your adversary, so on and so forth? So whereas the West focused on the material world to the detriment of everything else, the East just dissociated from the material world to the point of impracticality. Uh, and objectively speaking, I have to admit that the West seems to have been more successful, because the West was able to colonize the East, and not vice versa. Although for a long time, especially until 300 years ago, the East was much more prosperous than the West, because the constant conflict was relatively less in East as compared to the West. Then we come to quantum mechanics, and this is a place where I'll directly refer to Amourie de Riencourt, who as a historian who, as I mentioned, wrote this book, The Eye of Shiva. That is because whenever Western philosophers, or not physicists, right, who are modern day philosophers, they developed the latest theories of quantum mechanics, they found that their philosophical and ideological and Judeo-Christian worldviews, which had guided them thus far, right, Newton, Darwin, they were all devout Christians, and there were also a lot of Jews. It came to a point where that worldview could not support it. Why? Because quantum mechanics just broke open that worldview and just showed that that worldview was patently, if not false, at least limited on a wide variety or a plethora of points. I'll elucidate those points and go through them one by one. First one is that the life and the world are mainly pointless and purposeless. So if you ask what is the purpose of the universe to a physicist, he'll say that it doesn't. Your life has whatever meaning and purpose you want to assign to it, but as such inherent, there's no purpose. And this is exactly what a yogi or a Buddhist monk would say, that yeah, the universe is just an illusion spun by the god, so it doesn't have a purpose. The larger purpose is to unite with the Atma, or the Paramatma. Sorry. And yeah, this caused a lot of confusion. Then came something then came a person named Max Planck, who says that the fundamental laws ruling the physical world of that whenever they are taking place in a closed system, right? So whenever actions are taking place in a closed system, there will be that the state of it can be determined by one small integer, which is known as the integer function of Lagrange. And I don't claim to be smart enough to understand this part, but basically what he's saying in simple words is that there's a principle of minimal action, which is a different, which introduces a different kind of causality. Not like there's one thing which happens, then there's another thing which happens. So basically, that the cause and effect, right? That the cause is in the past and the effect is in the future. That is challenged. If you look at uh, physics as such, because in physics there's only one law of physics which has a time direction, right? And that is the law of entropy. But every other law of physics is the same forwards as well as it is as backwards, which pretty much destroys the concept of linear time, which was held by the West since pretty much their entire existence. Then in the book The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, it's a joint endeavor between Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung. They said that they question absolute determinism. So Newton lived in a worldview where if A plus B equal to C, and therefore whatever, so he lived in a world where everything could be determined by absolute mechanical and mathematical laws. But what we find with quantum mechanics is that's not possible. That never happens. No matter what law you apply, it can only be true at the level of statistics, but never true at the level of at absolute. So what do I mean by that? Let's say I'm saying that there's a antibiotic which will kill bacteria. I can never say that at this concentration this antibiotic will kill all bacteria. It's always like, yeah, this will, at this concentration according to our tests it will kill 50% of bacteria. But why is it killing 50% and not the other 50%? You can point out to genetics, or but if what if they're from the same stock? You can still say there are some epigenetic alterations, but at the end of the day you don't know. It's just a statistical phenomena. And this is true for every law of modern physics, modern chemistry, and modern biology. It's called I50, right? This concentration at which 50% of the bacteria will die, whatever. But point is that for every law of modern physics, it's only true at the level of statistics. You can never apply it to an individual, right? Then there's also the fact that quantum mechanics now states that antiparticles are particles which are moving backward in time, which again destroys the notion of linear time as propounded in the Judeo-Christian worldview. Another thing is known as quantum entanglement, which is that, well, Einstein said that the fastest rate at which information can travel in the universe is at the speed of light, which is 3 into 10 to the power 8 meters per second. However, quantum entangled particles are able to interact with each other at much greater distances, much faster than the speed of light, which means that they almost act as if they are one part of the whole thing, which is another thing which is propounded by the Eastern. So the East never ever bought into the West's idea that I am an individual, I'm discrete. It always said, yeah, you're part of the whole. Whatever your idea of self is an illusion. You're just one piece of the entire puzzle, and everything is connected to everything else. And that there's essentially one consciousness. And this again, quantum mechanics destroys the worldview that there are discrete objects which need. So this new thing destroyed Einstein's uh, worldview of a relatively deterministic universe. Then we come to the biology of purpose, right? That is, does life have a purpose? So what one finds is that as the universe tends to degrade over time, the law of entropy, that the how do you say that the universe tends towards disorder with time. However, if you look at biology, then evolution indicates an increasing complexity. Now modern physicists argue that as long as the net entropy of the universe is still tending towards disorder, it is still not a violation of that law, because even though within isolated systems, or within some closed systems, the universe is tending towards more complexity in the form of living organisms, uh, the net result is still that the universe is tending towards disorder. But this vague law is the only law which says that there is such a thing as time or linear time. That's the only thing. Then we come to Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty. So Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty said that you could either know the position of an electron with absolute certainty or the velocity. And he said that the more, whenever you try to find out the position of an electron, with absolute certainty, the more energy you would have to use, and the more chaos or more uncertain you would be about its speed, and vice versa. And this is not a question, many people misunderstand it as saying, yeah, well, our measurements are faulty. It's not so much as the measurements are faulty, but the way the mathematics works out is that you want to resolve two individual vectors in space, and electrons are a single point in space. They are a unidimensional point in space. And if you try to, like I'm explaining the mathematics of it, if you try to resolve one vector, then the margin of error for the other vector increases, and vice versa, because that's just how they're related mathematically. So again, it says that the law of determinism and the law of knowing with absolute certainty what is there is broken. And this is the insane link between, like, this entire worldview is, well, it was what was held by the East for the longest time, and modern quantum mechanics just seems to kind of validate it to a great extent. And like, I'm not exactly sure what to make of it. And so here's an example of biology. Neurophysiologists have discovered that the electrical pathways of the nerves appear to develop before the growth of the nervous tissue itself. That is, the implication being that they would constitute formative fields pre-existing the nervous matter guiding its development. That is, that the electrical fields, so neurons, they communicate with each other through electrochemical impulses. So oftentimes we see that before the nerves grow, their electrical pathways are apparent. And there's also some evidence regarding action potential and thinking potential. So, for example, let's say I want to pick up this cup because I'm addicted to cocaine. I'm not addicted to cocaine, I just have a nervous tick. So, anyway, when I want to pick up this cup, there's an intention wave in my brain, which is like, hey, you need to pick up this cup. And then there's the action potential, which indicates that I picked up this cup. However, when they imaged and measured it, oftentimes that the action potential indicating that I picked up the cup occurred before my thought that I would pick up the cup. So again and again, modern physics and modern science just dispels the notion of linear organized time. Uh, so yeah, and this is often this is often a reason why there was one of the many reasons why Jewish science was dismissed, and they called it Jewish science. I'm not calling it Jewish science, because a lot of the developments in theoretical physics was done by atheistic Jews, or Jews who had been secularized. So Jews were parted from their Abrahamic and Christian and Judeo-Christian worldview because they had that outsider perspective, and a lot of them were really impressed by the Bhagavad Gita. So you find Erwin Schrödinger quoting the Upanishads, and you find, of course, the famous quote by Robert Oppenheimer about "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," when he witnessed the explosion of the atomic bomb. So they were deeply influenced by the Eastern philosophy, because you need some kind of a raison d'être, or a reason for being, to drive your development into philosophy, to drive your development into science. And this was the Eastern this Eastern philosophy outlook provided the psychological undergirding which helped motivate the scientists to discover the universe. Because before that, Judeo-Christians thought, I will look at the beauty of God's providence, and I will examine and I will seek to understand God by understanding His laws. This is how Galileo, for example, this is how Charles Spencer Darwin thought of the world and the universe, which is also a beautiful way of thinking, but it's a very, very different way of thinking, which was not which at least most physicists found inadequate for describing quantum mechanics, sort of as an ideological undergirding. So basically, then we come to the many phenomena of quantum mechanics. First one is that particles in quantum mechanics just pop randomly in and out of existence. Then there's a phenomena of I'm forgetting the quantum tunneling, which is that sometimes instead of bouncing off, particles will randomly collapse into each other, which is how nuclear fusion takes place. Particles will randomly jump from place to place. Then there's the phenomenon of quantum biology, where an electron in the chiral ring of chlorophyll takes all possible paths at the same time, which is also impossible if from classical mechanics. Then there's the worldview that the electron itself is a wave of statistical probability which gets resolved. Then there's the double slit experiment. The double slit experiment says that the electrons are behaving as a wave, and they continue to behave as a wave, in fact, even generating an interference pattern. But the moment you try to detect the electron, it gets resolved and the electrons begin to behave like particles. So the main contention of the West, right, which was that the observer should play no part in a system, and by removing the observer, removing his or her subjective experience, only then you can glimpse upon the truth, that was shattered. Because like what the East had said, that it is the subject, it is the perceiver who is the most important. It is to some extent his own consciousness which resolves and determines the behavior of electrons themselves. Pretty much shattered this worldview. And this is the worldview that is, we find ourselves in a weird place. We find ourselves in a time of unique crisis, simply because when we were animistic, we saw God everywhere. There was no distinction between the spiritual and material world. Then the East and the West diverged in two different ways. They took two different paths, where the West saw God as like basically an inert object, and just who had made a bunch of laws, and they studied the material world, because they felt that we felt as human beings, we felt the void that God left, that we just stopped believing in the gods of our ancestors, and we stopped believing in that magical divine outlook, and we felt bereft in our souls. The West tried to understand God's mind by studying natural law and studying the material world. The East engaged in you can say intellectual traditions to liberate the consciousness and attain nirvana and become close to or one with God. But now we find ourselves fusing back together as the East and the West have come together through quantum mechanics and quantum mechanical thinking. I have no idea what the future holds, but I just know that I just feel with every fiber of my being and from the bottom of my soul that a relationship with God, or a knowledge or an intimation of divinity, is truly what drives the human soul forward in life. And if you are bereft of God, then I believe then it is often the path to utter nihilism and utter despair. And that is why I believe that there is not a single civilization in the entire history of mankind which has been atheistic. There have been civilized societies which claimed atheism, like North Korea and USSR and whatever, but they just crumbled in the sands of time, and they were brutal places to be. And even there, even in North Korea, where people say that there's no God, people say about Kim Jong Un that he does not need to go to the toilet, or he can read thoughts. So they just replaced one god with another. So we need God, and this is our way to God. And as the Hindus would say, ekam satyam vipraha bahuda vedanti, that there is one truth, but there are multiple ways to that one truth. But I also believe that hopefully East and the West can join and find God, or at least continue our mission of searching for him. Thank you. Like, share, and subscribe.